Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tyson Gargis with Ricardo Amigo Real Estate. It's another beautiful day in sunny southern Baja. We're here in the Las Tunas neighborhood of Todos Santos, and today we're going to be speaking about the current state of the market. It's been 6 months, so we're going to go through the mid-year market update. And when we do this, we're going to be comparing 2025, that same period, the first 6 months, to our current time period, the first 6 months of 2026. And when we speak about this market, what we're talking about is our market here in Todos Santos, which geographically goes from Elías Calles in the south up to Agua Blanca in the north. So let's dive into these numbers. We're going to start off with land. We saw a peak in land sales actually in 2024. And since that time, they came down a little bit last year in 2025, and they've continued to come down in 2026. So let's talk about that. For the numbers, we're down 40% in actual land transactions. So individual transactions went from 72 to 43. Median price has changed just a little bit. It's actually increased 3%. Days on market has stayed relatively the same. It's gone from 208 to 202. I take all of this information from the MLS. So the days on market, that is the way the MLS does it. They go from when the property is first listed to when the property finally closes. So that actually includes that entire part of the closing process in there when we speak about days on market. Just a little tidbit. Sales volume has actually decreased quite a bit. We've seen a 35% drop from 2025 to 2026, 14.8 million to 9.6 million. So a pretty substantial decrease in total sales volume. So let's talk about these numbers and what this actually means when we're talking about land. What we've actually seen here in our market is quite a shift in the demographic of buyers. What we had a lot of in the past is people purchasing land, maybe moving a trailer or building a plop or something like that on the property, and maybe taking a little bit longer to build, working with a local builder, maybe going to Guadalajara to actually, furnish their home that they've just completed, maybe even designing this home themselves. We're not seeing that as much anymore. What we've seen is a shift in our buyer demographic. The pace of life has increased. People have gotten exponentially busier. We've seen people with the financial means, but maybe not the time to actually go through an entire building project. And we're seeing, quite an exodus from land into already built homes and condos, which is where a lot of those buyers that were purchasing land in the past have actually shifted. So if you're looking to maybe purchase land right now, it's an excellent time. There's a lot of great inventory, and prices right now are probably the best they're going to be for the next couple years. Let's talk about condos. We don't have a substantial amount of inventory of condominiums like there are in other areas, Cabo and La Paz, which are obviously very close to us. A lot of the bulk of our condo market comes from Cerritos. And over the past few years, we've actually seen quite an increase in inventory in condos, but we haven't seen necessarily an increase in the amount of sales of those condos. The numbers right here, make it perfectly obvious. So in 2025, we had 15 condos that sold in that first year, the first 6 months, what we're speaking of today. 2026, 16. So not much of a change, actually a 7% difference, but really not a substantial change. The median price of condos, as there's been more inventory and kind of some of the lower price condos have come online, the median price is decreased by 18%. So we've seen a drop from 430,000 to 350,500. The days on market, like we talked about, the inventory has increased, prices have come down. There's more competition when it comes to condominiums, and there's more stuff on kind of the lower end. So the days on market has actually increased 120% from 120 days on market on average in 2025 to 264 days on average in 2026. Condo volume, the overall sales volume is what we're talking about there when we talk about that sales volume number. The aggregate price of everything that's sold so far, 7.3 million in 2025, and we've seen a decrease of 24% to about 5.6 million in 2026. So when we talk about condos, they don't make up a large portion of our market. Still, the bulk of our volume, when we look at it, is in land and homes. Homes make up the bulk of our market. So condos are more like an ancillary, but they still are kind of a bellwether for what's going on in the broader market. We've seen an increase in inventory during what could be considered a relatively slower period. So that's where all those numbers are coming from. And I think anyone who's really looked at this market or kind of really dove in, that would come as no surprise to them. Moving on to homes. So homes, as we discussed, really do make up now the bulk of our market. It really used to be land for quite a number of years, but the last few years we've seen a significant shift into homes. So homes in 2025, the amount of transactions through the first half of the year 2025 was 40. This year we're down to 34, so it's a 15% change. Median price has actually decreased 7%. Median price is a good indicator, but it doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. If we looked at average price, the average price has increased quite a bit because we've seen quite a few more homes sell in what for us is kind of the upper end of our market, that million plus, up to kind of 3 million is kind of, that makes up the bulk of the upper end of our market. We've seen a lot of movement in those homes, and we've seen a lot of movement in kind of the 400,000, 500,000 and below. That's kind of where we're seeing the bulk of the movement in the market. We're not seeing as much movement in the market as we've seen in years past, and kind of that 600 to 800, 600 to $900,000 price range. Days on market have actually decreased just slightly from 238 to 209, and sales volume just barely dropped from 30.8 million in 2025 to 29.9 million in 2026. So homes, like I said, we've seen a drop in the number of transactions, but we're seeing those home prices, that upper end is kind of what's moving, and that's bringing up the volume overall of the whole market. That's why you're seeing that decrease in transactions, but you're actually seeing that the volume is not changing to kind of reflect that, from 15% of transactions down to only 3% in volume down. That just kind of shows us that upper end is really moving, and that's bringing up kind of the whole market when it comes to sales volume. So let's wrap this up. Let's talk about total sales volume in the overall market. That's homes, condos, land, everything that's sold. And once again, we're talking about everything that's sold. This is just properties that have sold on market. These are properties that come from the MLS. That's where all these statistics are pulled from. So the first half of 2025, the first 6 months, it was 53 million in total sales volume. This year, the first 6 months, the first half of 2026, we're at 45.1. So we've seen a drop in sales volume by 15% so far this year. Total transactions, 2025, we're at 127 at this point last year. This year, we're at 93. So we've seen a drop in total transactions by 27%. The sales volume is about half of the total transaction amount. So while we're seeing the transactions have dropped, the average price for things that are selling is actually increased. So those numbers, that's why those numbers are kind of not quite in line. So while we're down at this point in the year through the first 6 months, we've actually seen quite an increase over the course of May and June in properties going under contract. And those properties will be closing during the second half of this coming year. So it'd be really interesting when we do the year-end market update to actually see what that does to our overall numbers when we're comparing 2025 to 2026. My guess, and I don't have a crystal ball, but my guess would be we come probably a lot closer in line with the total numbers in 2025 as we get to the end of 2026, but time will tell. So I will see you for the year-end market update.